Hey everybody, welcome back. This week I am going to start a 3-episode series where I'm going to be talking about enterprise podcasting. And I will explain what that is, but essentially it's the basic idea of using a podcast internally for large companies or businesses where they need to communicate internally or maybe even want to communicate with their stakeholders and things like that. So do you have a large company or maybe a group of employees that you want to communicate with regularly? And do you listen to podcasts already? You're listening to this one and you think maybe, hey, it would be really nice to have my own. Do you have something to say and you want an effective way to share your message? Well, if your goal is to determine if a podcast would help you communicate inside your business, I'm here today to walk you through why podcasts work for this type of communication and also show you how several corporations have used them successfully. One of the benefits of being a podcast producer is that I actually get to see this in practice behind the scenes, and I get to know the truth from the fiction. I know what's working for clients like these, what is helping them communicate internally and grow their businesses, audiences, and communities. So let's talk a little bit about podcasting inside a business. Well, we've talked about the benefits of podcasting before. We've talked about the know, like, and trust factor. We've talked about how podcast listeners are more likely to buy stuff. We've talked about podcasts as an evergreen asset. But one of the things that we haven't talked about is that podcasting is simply just better than a lot of traditional communications. I mean, do you like meetings? Do you like memos? Do you like those too long, didn't read emails? No, yeah, I didn't think so. Let's take a look at why podcasts are actually better than traditional communications. First, well, podcasts are more convenient, right? They can be consumed in many different locations during many more types of activities. They can also be consumed at double speed, 2 times speed, 2x, whatever you want to call it, for people that want to finish them faster. Secondly, some people actually prefer to listen to something versus read it or watch it. Audiences are different in their preferences and the ways they learn. It's very effective to provide multiple ways to consume content. Thirdly, a podcast allows leaders to connect virtually, one-on-one with the employee. So if you're in a large organization where the CEO or the COO may never meet each employee one-to-one, the podcast is actually a chance to connect in that way. Additionally, a leader also has much more freedom to connect authentically, even be vulnerable in a podcast that they're recording alone in a room versus being on stage in front of a large crowd or in a meeting. And finally, you get the chance to reach the non-desk worker, the employees in retail or sales and service teams, things like that. You can also bridge time zones because listeners can listen on their own schedule. Podcasts are a more engaging way to communicate than text or video. We know that already. And they're better than traditional communications because they're more convenient. They reach different audiences. They make leaders more accessible, and they reach all employees. So what is an enterprise podcast? Well, generally they are generated inside a business, similar to podcasts you might already be listening to. But what's the difference? So let's take a look. The difference is that they're only available to employees or stakeholders, and they're behind some sort of wall. So how's that possible? Well, there are several media hosts like Libsyn, my preferred media host. Podbean does this. Blueberry does this as well, who offer enterprise podcast hosting solutions to allow you to securely provide your podcast only to employees. They offer different types and different levels of security and often build an app specifically for your employees to use. Using this style of delivery actually allows you to include sensitive information in podcast episodes. This might be messages from leaders, team meeting recordings, important company announcements or marketing announcements, organizational changes, and even human resource announcements. You can think about employee orientation or onboarding. This can be handled through podcasts as well. Talent development, education, and training can be done through the use of a podcast library. Corporate earnings calls and annual meeting recordings could be shared. And departments can communicate with each other in a secure way without letting information out to the public. Enterprise podcasts are very similar to traditional podcasts, but they are secure and only available to employees and potentially stakeholders. Okay, so let's talk about some real life examples of how corporations have used podcasts. But before we move on, just take a moment now to write down some of the topics that you could discuss in your own enterprise podcast. Okay. So when we think about enterprises that have effectively used podcasts, Marriott is the first business that comes to my mind. I'm going to walk you through two ways that Marriott has used podcasts for recruitment, training, and development. First of all, Marriott is an international corporation with tons of employees. And we know through data that the average cost of hiring an employee is $4,129 per employee. And that the cost of training them is an additional $1,075 per employee. But Marriott was seeing employee turnover of around 10% to 20% each year, and that is a huge loss of funds. What Marriott did was they created a recruiting podcast where they were able to engage with their candidate population before the interview process started. They were able to communicate what it was like to work for Marriott and give the candidates an ability to understand that. They shared their culture, their values, and their employee value proposition. The result of that, people who applied for the jobs already knew they wanted to work for Marriott and were much more likely to stay and not leave after 1 or 2 years, like the average turnover they were seeing. Secondly, Marriott, along with several other corporations, have also used podcasts with employees for training and education, allowing them to learn while they commute, just like you would with any podcast. That's a game changer, especially in an age where attention spans are steadily becoming shorter and shorter. Marriott saw a way to connect with potential employees before they even applied and then helped them understand what working for Marriott was like. This reduced the regular turnover rate and helped them keep good employees with the company for a longer period of time. Now, how could you use podcasts in recruitment and training? Take a moment now to write down several regular training tasks that you might actually be able to accomplish with a podcast. Now, here's another example when we think about just communications and culture building. Walt Disney World may be the happiest place on earth, but with such a large organization, a degree of connection between leadership and employees is really crucial. Without this connection, employees can lose sight of the bigger picture, and the happiest place can quickly become the unhappiest place on earth. That's why executives have decided to connect with their cast members, or employees, that's how Disney refers to them. They've decided to connect on a weekly basis using podcasts. So let's take a look at how vice presidents at Walt Disney World use podcasts to share stories, recognize cast members, and meet them face to face. Disney World has over 70,000 cast members working in the resort. Dan Cockrell, who was vice president of the Magic Kingdom, one of the parks at the resort, couldn't meet all of his 25,000 employees. So he started a podcast to have meaningful contact with all of his employees on a weekly basis. He also spent time walking around the park daily, but he could never meet everyone. So on the podcast, he would feature guest compliments about particular cast members. He would share information that he needed to communicate. And he would also share a little bit about himself so that people felt like they knew Dan, even though they would probably never meet him or potentially might never meet him. Following Dan's lead, several other VPs have started podcasts for their parks. Leaders like Dan Cockrell know that a podcast can be used to build a relationship with listeners. And when your listeners are employees who truly need to connect with you in an authentic way as a leader, a podcast is the best way to spend quality time with all of your employees. So think about it. Do you have 10 to 15 minutes a week to record a short podcast for your employees and make that connection? And finally, let's just talk a little bit about internal communications. The recent COVID-19 pandemic had many companies scrambling to communicate internally with all their employees when all of a sudden they couldn't send them messages over internal communication systems because they were outside the company, they were at home. So let's take a look at how one corporation has used podcasts to communicate internally before the pandemic and how another discovered that their existing podcast was an incredible asset once the pandemic shut everything down. Now, you know Geico. Geico has funny commercials, but they've also used podcasts off and on for several reasons. Geico has multiple headquarters all across the country covering different regions. They also have a lot of employees like claims adjusters who are constantly out on the road. They've used their podcast to share information internally around the country, which helps them communicate with their employees who are out on the road. Now, another company, NOV, who manufactures and maintains equipment for the oil and gas industry, has over 36,000 employees in 64 countries at over 600 facilities. Initially, they started their internal podcast as a way to engage with all of their employees around the world. They have regular roundtable episodes with C-suite leaders, helping explain some of the decisions being made in the business and how and why those decisions are important to all the employees. This creates a sense of ownership. They also feature employees from around the world and from different levels of the business to foster a deeper connection among employees across the greater organization. Unexpectedly, the podcast became an incredible asset as a form of crisis communication during the COVID pandemic. At the beginning of the pandemic, NOV was able to use its podcast to communicate health and safety protocols across the company. And then once things began to open up more, they were able to reassure their employees about the state of the company and the state of their jobs. Podcast is a quick way to securely share information and connect with all of your employees whenever you need to. The experience of the pandemic has likely shown you how important it is to be able to communicate with them using your voice in addition to other methods. Now, next week, I'm actually going to have Michael Gaines on the podcast. He works with NOV and he is in charge of their podcast. He is going to share with us some of the experiences and some of the ways that they've used their podcast that I just wasn't able to share with you today. So I look forward to that, and hopefully I will see you next week. Have you ever wondered how other podcasters grow their audience? Well, one of the best ways to do this is by being a guest on other podcasts, borrowing their audiences. So that's why I created the Publicity Power Pack. It's a product designed to help you learn how to network with other podcasters and get invited onto their shows. There's really no better way to grow your audience. The Publicity Power Pack provides you with everything you need to network with other podcasters, be a better guest, send pitches that people actually respond to, and begin your journey towards becoming an in-demand guest. So what are you waiting for? Let me help you grow your podcast starting today. Get the Publicity Power Pack only for $27. You can go to DannyOsmond.com/PPP to get it today.